one day 2 members of the firm picked Whittaker up. He owed them money and they were angry. Kevin Whittaker was in serious trouble.
In the summer of 1994, as Darren Nichols was struggling to stay on the straight and narrow, another petty criminal from Essex was also desperately trying to put the past behind him. Kevin Whittaker seemed to be on the right track. He'd managed to kick his long-term cocaine habit. He was holding down a steady, well-paid job that he really enjoyed. He had given up drug dealing, and his beloved long-term girlfriend Alison was expecting the couple's first child. It was the kind of life that few would have predicted for the former tearaway, whose first brush with the law had come a decade earlier, at the tender age of 18. He and 2 friends, Mark Phillips and Alan Venner, drunk on a mixture of cheap lager and Pernod, had broken into the Kingswood Junior School in Basildon and started playing around with some matches. The handful of small fires that set took hold rapidly, and within minutes 2 classrooms were completely ablaze. Nearly £100,000 worth of damage had been done. Whittaker and his friends were seen running away from the school and were arrested a few days later. When it came to court, Phillips and Venner were convicted of arson and sentenced to 18 months each. Whittaker was acquitted, but was sentenced to 9 months youth custody for his part in a series of burglaries that came to light as a result of the investigation. After his release, Whittaker went back to living with his parents, Albert and Joan, who encouraged him to find work and to try and sort his life out. He went through a succession of menial jobs, none of which lasted more than a few weeks, and ended up spending most of his time on the dole. Despite this, he never seemed particularly short of cash or company. His friends would come round all the time, and they would all have mobile phones and expensive cars, but none of them were working, says Albert. Kevin had also started smoking cannabis, almost all the time. I told him I didn't want it in the house, but he just carried on regardless. Sometimes he would disappear for a few days at a time, and then there were times we would get phone calls in the middle of the night. They seemed really desperate to get hold of Kevin, but they'd only ever leave their first names, no numbers. At the back of my mind, I suspected he was involved in drug dealing, but there didn't seem to be anything we could do. According to one of his school friends, Simon Smith, Whittaker had started dabbling in drug dealing soon after being released from prison. He started out selling tiny amounts of cannabis strictly to his friends, slowly built up the scale of his business until he was trading whole ounces at a time to everyone and making enough money out of it and the dole to be quite comfortable off. By the early 90s, Whittaker's drug dealing operation would have been turning a tiny profit, had it not been for the fact that most of his earnings were disappearing straight up his nose. The first time I saw Kevin snort cocaine was at a party in Southend in 1992, says Smith. A few days later, he confided in me that he was a cocaine addict, but he was confident that he would be able to control it. But from what I could see, it was just getting worse and worse. Whittaker had many sources for his drugs, but the one he favoured most was a certain Craig Rolfe, an arrogant, stocky young man who seemed determined to make a name for himself in the Essex underworld. I met Craig about half a dozen times in all, and immediately formed the opinion that I didn't really like him, says Simon Smith. And maybe that was a bit quiet around people, I don't know, but for some reason I just couldn't click with him. He hadn't done anything wrong, it was just my instinct telling me not to trust him. That Craig Rolfe would end up pursuing a life of crime was inevitable as night following day. He was born on the 7th of June 1969 in the hospital unit of Holloway Prison, where his mother Lorraine was serving 18 months for making false statements. The attractive 23-year-old had been having a passionate affair with 19-year-old John Kennedy behind the back of a market trader husband Brian Rolfe for the best part of 2 years. Just before Christmas 1967, the pair had eloped to Birmingham. But within a few weeks, Lorraine discovered she was expecting Rolfe's child and opted to return to her husband rather than stay with the jobless Kennedy. The affair continued, however, and over the months that followed, Kennedy became increasingly frustrated at Lorraine's refusal to end her marriage. In the small hours of Christmas Eve 1968, he decided he had had enough. He broke into the couple's house, crept up to the main bedroom, and as Brian lay asleep next to his wife, smashed his skull to pieces with 3 hefty blows from a bowling alley skittle. Lorraine awoke to the horrific scene to find Kennedy kneeling beside her. "I've done this to prove how much I love you," he said before dragging the body from the marital bed and dumping it in a van at the side of the road to make it look like a bungled robbery. Just days after the brutal killing, Lorraine, by then a mother of 3, discovered that Rolfe had got her pregnant once more. It didn't take police long to crack the case, and within a few days both she and Kennedy were arrested and charged with murder. The following March, Kennedy was sentenced to life. Lorraine, who broke down sobbing in court as her lover was sent down, was cleared of murder and convicted of lying to the police to throw them off Kennedy's scent. "I done nothing," she screamed as she was led down to the cells. With skeletons like those in his closet, it's no surprise that the young Craig Rolfe turned out to be a difficult child. He had precious little time for rules and regulations, and even less time for the classroom. For him, school was just a place where you got into fights and met up with your friends. Studying for exams was something that only idiots did. By the age of 16, Rolfe would become a classic juvenile delinquent, rebelling against pretty much everything that society had to offer, and picking up a few minor convictions along the way. He worked briefly as a tyre fitter, then as a plasterer, but the only thing he ever truly applied himself to was the study of drugs, happy sampling whatever he could lay his hands on. It was around that time that Rolfe started dating Donna Jaggers, a local girl with a handful of convictions for shoplifting and cheque fraud. Eager to impress the new lady in his life, Rolfe began selling drugs in nightclubs around Basildon. The relationship was turbulent to say the least, but no matter how much they argued and fought, somehow the pair found they couldn't live without each other. Just a few months after they began going out, Donna was horrified to discover that she was pregnant. She booked herself into an abortion clinic, but Rolfe, fantastically close to his mother and desperate for a child of his own, persuaded her to see it through with a promise that he would look after them all. Rolfe was never going to be a criminal mastermind, but it didn't take long for him to realise that although selling drugs was a profitable part-time business, buying them was too much like hard work and something of a mug's game. If you needed some gear, all you had to do was find someone to strike a deal with and then rip them off. Powerfully built and absolutely fearless, Rolfe excelled at the task. Craig and Donna's daughter was born in the autumn of 1990. A few weeks later, Craig made a drug sale that was to dictate the path the rest of his life was to follow. A long dark-haired man turned up at Rolfe's house, having been told by friends there was some good quality cocaine available. As is the custom, a small test supply was arranged. "This is good gear. Where does it come from?" asked the man. Rolfe, high on his own supply, saw no reason to hide the truth. "Dunno, nicked it off some pikey fucker down on the coast." The man was Tony Tucker, another up-and-coming face in the Essex underworld. After getting out of the army in the late 80s, Tucker had worked briefly as a carpenter before starting up a small firm supplying doormen for clubs and bars. At the time, Tucker was a small-time businessman with criminal learnings. He lived in a modest two-bedroom house, drove a second-hand Granada, and occasionally made a little money on the side. A keen bodybuilder, Tucker recruited staff for his doorman firm from gyms across the county to make sure they looked the part as much as he did himself. Tucker's timing was perfect. The second summer of love was in full swing, and acid house parties and outdoor raves were all the rage. The demand for doormen grew, and the security business quickly became Tucker's sole source of income. These burly lads were also in demand as debt collectors, and it didn't take Tucker long to realise that, even if there was no debt, big blokes with a lot of front could still collect money. One of his earliest scams involved some stables near Basildon, where he kept his horses. He sent in a group of heavies into the bar of the riding school, where they proceeded to smash the place to pieces and threaten the staff. The next day, a concerned Tucker went to see the owner. He earnestly explained that he'd heard about the trouble on the grapevine and had a good idea who was involved. Through his contacts in his firm, he could ensure the men never came back. All he would ask in return was that he could stable his horses for free for the rest of his life. Like Rolfe, Tucker also liked to rip off drug dealers. He would slowly gain someone's confidence and then explain that through his connections in the club scene he would be able to shift a large amount of drugs. The idea would be to give the dealer the impression that Tucker had never done anything like it before, that he was simply doing them a favour. The last thing they would ever expect is that he was about to stitch them up. Having acquired the drugs, Tucker would then disappear to meet with a buyer. He returned a little later looking shell-shocked, saying the police had raided the meeting place. He'd been forced to dump the drugs and run for it. There isn't much etiquette in the drug world, but one accepted protocol is that if you are the courier, the go-between in the drugs deal, and it all comes on top, then it's down to you to repay the debt. Tucker was only too aware of this, and fronted them out. He got away with it every time. Few people were brave enough to argue. To take on Tucker was to take on his entire firm. When Tucker met Rolfe, he immediately recognised a kindred spirit, and took him under his wing. At the time of the meeting, Rolfe was 21 and Tucker was 33. For Rolfe, Tucker was the father figure he'd always craved. What made it even better was the fact that Tucker was living the life that he was himself aiming for. Tucker drove either a black Porsche with the number plate TT9 or his brand new Jaguar. He had a large, nicely decorated house in diamond-closed Trafford 100 and had a wardrobe to die for. He even had enough cash to buy his then wife a Porsche 924. Rolfe was particularly impressed with the fact that Tucker hung around with the celebrity set. He was the personal minded too and a close friend of the boxer Nigel Benn, having been at the ringside for many of his fights. Rolfe's personal cocaine habit was become ruinously expensive, and hanging around with Tucker meant there was near constant supply for free. Tucker benefited too. Rolfe was a devoted, willing and reliable general, happy to run around and do every mundane errand that was put before him. Then there was the admiration. So far as Rolfe was concerned, Tucker was the best bloke in the world ever. He made sure that everyone he met knew it. If it ever came up on top, Tucker knew that Rolfe would do absolutely everything he could to protect him. He would literally take a bullet for him. And in the world that Tucker was moving in, it never hurt to have someone like that around. It was a match made in heaven. Over the next couple of years, Tucker's business grew to the point that he was turning over $5,000 each week just from providing doormen. His earnings soared even higher once the younger and more streetwise Rolfe turned him onto the idea of cashing in on the rapid growth of the club's drug scene. Controlling the doors of a club instantly means you control who sells drugs inside. Tucker began to charge dealers rent of around £1,000 a week in return for granting them exclusive access to his club. Rolfe was rewarded with what he considered to be the perfect job, one that gave him credibility at the bank and allowed him to apply for a mortgage, but one that he never had to turn up at the office. In fact, he didn't have to do anything at all. The job, a director of Tucker's security company with a salary of $30,000 per year, existed only on paper, but to Rolfe it was worth its weight in gold. Although Rolfe had no active role in the day-to-day business, he was clearly involved in helping Tucker keep other employers in check. The reputation of both men was usually enough to ensure that those they employed behaved themselves. On the few occasions that somebody was stupid enough to step out of line, the pair ensured the matter was dealt with ruthlessly so to discourage others from doing the same. One such punishment beating was caught on a CCTV camera, trained in on the car park of an Essex pub. The grainy black and white footage shows Tucker and Rolfe hauling the man out of the exit, pushing him hard against the wall. They poke him hard in the chest as the accusations fly, slapping him in the face to encourage him to answer. The petrified victim doesn't know which way to look or what to say, but then the first punch comes. He crumbles to the ground and rolls about, clenching his face in agony. The pain grows more intense as the kicks follow, thick and fast. Then Tucker backs off, breathing hard with the exertion. Rolfe leans forward and picks the man up, propping him against the wall so that Tucker can hit him some more. There are punches to his head, kicks to the groin, elbows, knees and headbutts until the man finally collapses, unconscious and senseless. Only then do the pair walk away, safe in the knowledge that no matter who might have seen them, no one would dare speak out against them. Another film shows Rolfe slapping lightly across the face someone who then collapses in a pool of blood. In fact, the man had been slashed around the face with a Stanley knife. In July 1994, the final part of the jigsaw that would transform Tucker and Rolfe into an unstoppable force, Pat Tate, was released on parole. Tate was immediately installed into the business and took charge of acquiring yet more drugs for distribution throughout the pubs and clubs under Tucker's control. Any criminal worth his salt knows that being banged up in prison is no excuse for dropping out of the game. And so it was that Pat Tate had continued to organise highly professional drug shipments by phone whilst being held in cells in numerous prisons up and down the county. That, combined with the contacts he'd made while serving time, made him a valuable member of the team. Ripping off dealers was fine for acquiring small amounts, an ounce there, a half kilo here, but the smart money bought the stuff in bulk from reliable sources. With Tate on board, the price of the ecstasy, cocaine and speed that Tucker was able to buy dropped dramatically. Profits from trading in the club soared, and the gang even began re-exporting drugs to the holiday market in Tenerife and Ibiza. Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were on their way to dominating the club's drug scene across Essex. Around the time that Whittaker started dealing with Craig Rolfe, he also started up a relationship with Alison Pinkton.